Somewhere in a glass tower 40 floors above the city, a man was about to hire the one woman who could either save his empire or destroy it, and he had no idea which. Damian Voss did not know her name yet. He only knew that $17 million had disappeared from accounts that should have been impossible to touch, and that the last person who tried to find out where it went had simply stopped answering his phone 3 weeks ago. Nobody in Damian's world stopped answering their phone by accident. So when his assistant slid a single folder across his desk with the words, "She's the best forensic auditor in the state, and she has no idea who you really are," Damian didn't smile. He never smiled before a decision. He simply opened the folder, looked at the photograph clipped to the top page, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Nobody in that building knew her name yet either, not the guards at the front desk, not the assistants who would soon learn to schedule around her, not the man who would spend the next several weeks trying to decide whether letting her close was the smartest decision of his life or the most reckless one. Her name was Cora Ashford. Cora, to the very few people who knew her well enough to shorten it. 29 years old, quiet, meticulous, the kind of woman who wore cardigans over blouses and kept her hair pinned back so tightly it looked like armor. She ran a small independent accounting practice 2 blocks from the courthouse, the kind of business that balanced the books for dentists and dry cleaners, and nothing about her file suggested she had ever been within 100 miles of organized crime. That was precisely why Damian's people had chosen her. Nobody would suspect the curvy woman in the sensible shoes of catching a killer hiding inside a spreadsheet. Nobody except the man who had spent his entire life learning to see past what people wanted him to see. Before we go any further into this story, if you're the kind of person who loves dark tales of power, obsession, and the kind of tension that makes your chest tight, go ahead and hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Mafia boss stories, because this one is going to get under your skin. And once you meet Damian Voss, once you understand exactly what kind of man he is, and exactly what Cora Ashford is about to walk into, I want you in the comments telling me, would you have taken the job? Would you have walked into that building knowing something was wrong? Or would you have turned around and run? Now let's get back to it. Cora almost didn't take the meeting. The email had come from a shipping and logistics conglomerate called Voss Maritime, offering triple her normal rate for what they described as a discreet internal audit, and every instinct honed over 4 years of forensic accounting told her that discreet was a word people used when they meant secret, and secret was a word people used when they meant dangerous. But her lease was due in 11 days. Her father's medical bills had eaten through the last of her savings, and the number on that email made her stomach twist with a hunger she was ashamed of. So on a gray Tuesday morning, she put on her best blazer, the one that actually buttoned across her chest without pulling, and she walked into the lobby of Voss Maritime with her spine straight and her nerves screaming. She met him for exactly 4 minutes before she understood she had made a terrible mistake, and an even worse decision. Damian Voss did not rise to greet her the way most men in his position performed politeness. He simply watched her cross the room, his dark eyes tracking the way she moved, the way she held her folder against her chest like a shield, and when she finally sat across from him, he said only, "You're not what I expected." Cora, who had spent her whole life being told exactly that, in exactly that tone, felt her jaw tighten. "Is that a problem, Mr. Voss?" she asked, and something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like respect, though she would spend the next several weeks unable to decide if respect was the right word for it, or if it was something far more dangerous wearing respect's clothes. He explained the job in careful clipped sentences. $17 million, gone from 3 accounts that should have required his personal authorization to move. A previous accountant, a man named Warren Pell, who had been reviewing the books and had since vanished from every record Damian's people could find. No flights, no hotel check-ins, no calls to family, nothing. Damian called it a resignation. Cora heard the word and watched the muscle tighten along his jaw, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who spent her professional life reading what numbers refused to say out loud, that he did not believe his own explanation any more than she did. She should have left then. She told herself that every night for the first week, lying awake in her small apartment, with 3 bankers' boxes of financial records stacked against her wall like a wall of secrets. But there was something underneath the fear that she refused to look at directly, something that hummed low in her chest every time she remembered the way Damian Voss had looked at her, not like she was invisible, the way most rooms treated her, but like she was the only solid thing in a world built entirely of smoke. It terrified her more than the missing $17 million did. She had built her whole life around being the reliable, overlooked woman in the corner, the one nobody watched too closely, and Damian Voss watched her like she was the only thing worth watching in the entire building. What none of them knew, not Damian, not his men, not even the ghost of Warren Pell haunting the edges of every account she opened, was that Cora Ashford had not always been an accountant who did tax returns for dry cleaners. 6 years ago, before the case that ended it, before the testimony that got a federal witness killed on her watch and made her walk away from a badge she'd earned with 4 years of her 20s, Cora had traced dirty money for the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. She knew how to read a shell company the way other people read a face. She knew the particular grammar of laundering, the shipping invoices that didn't match cargo weights, the offshore accounts that existed only to exist, the way real criminals hid real theft inside legitimate loss. She had told herself she would never use that skill again. She had told herself a great many things. The first 3 weeks passed in a strange, suffocating rhythm. Cora would arrive each morning to a private office on the 38th floor, its door guarded by a silent man named Reyes, who never quite smiled and never quite looked away from her either. She would work through ledgers that told one story on their surface and, if you knew how to look, whispered another story underneath. And every afternoon, without fail, Damian Voss would appear in her doorway sometime after 4 o'clock, never asking permission, simply standing there in a doorway that seemed too small to contain him, watching her work with an intensity that made the numbers on the page blur together. He did not touch her. He barely spoke to her, some days, saying only a handful of clipped sentences about her progress before disappearing back into whatever violence occupied the rest of his day. And yet Cora found herself counting the minutes until 4 o'clock, the way she used to count the minutes until Friday, and she hated herself a little more each time she caught herself doing it. There was a particular kind of danger in a man like Damian Voss, not the danger of his hands, which she never doubted could break a person without hesitation, but the danger of his attention, focused and total and utterly without apology. He did not perform charm. He simply existed in a room like gravity, and Cora, who had spent her whole life being the one who left rooms unnoticed, found herself unable to look away. It was on a Thursday night, 3 weeks into the audit, that she found the first thread. A shipping manifest for a container that had supposedly carried industrial machine parts to Rotterdam listed a cargo weight that made no physical sense, too light by nearly 4 tons for what the paperwork claimed was inside. She pulled the insurance filing. She pulled the customs declaration. She pulled the wire transfer that had paid for the shipment and traced it backward through 2 shell companies registered in the same Delaware office suite until it landed, quietly, unmistakably, in a personal account that had been opened using Warren Pell's Social Security number 3 days before he disappeared. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the old, familiar electricity of a trail she recognized, the exact shape of a scheme she had chased once before in a different life, in a different city, before it had cost a man his life and cost her everything else. She sat alone in the glass office at 9 at night, with the proof glowing on her screen, and she understood two things with total clarity. Warren Pell had not resigned, and whoever had built this scheme had built it carefully enough and close enough to Damian Voss that they had to be someone he trusted completely. She should have told Damian immediately. Instead, she found herself staring at the name on the account's authorized signatory list, a name she had seen 100 times over the past 3 weeks, attached to invoices and approvals and quiet nods from across conference rooms. Nikolai Reyes, the silent man who guarded her door every single day. The man Damian called his right hand, the man who had been at Damian's side since they were both 19 years old and clawing their way up from nothing together. Cora closed her laptop slowly, her pulse hammering, and understood that she was no longer just untangling a financial crime. She was standing in the center of a betrayal that had been building for years, waiting for someone naive enough, or brave enough, or desperate enough for the money to finally see it. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against her apartment door, the deadbolt thrown, replaying every interaction she'd had with Nikolai Reyes over the past 3 weeks. The way he watched her leave each evening, the way he'd asked, almost too casually, how her work was progressing, whether she'd found anything interesting yet. She had told him nothing, some instinct older than conscious thought keeping her mouth shut every time. Now she understood that instinct had probably saved her life. The next morning, she went to Damian's office instead of her own, and for the first time since she'd walked into that building 3 weeks earlier, she watched Damian Voss lose the composure that seemed to be stitched into his very bones. She laid the trail out for him piece by piece. The manifest, the customs filing, the shell companies, the account opened in a dead man's name, and she watched something in his face go very still and very cold. The particular stillness of a man doing violence to himself, just to keep from doing violence to something else. "Say his name," Damian said quietly when she'd finished, and Cora understood he already knew, that some part of him had known for longer than he wanted to admit, and simply needed to hear it out loud from someone he had, against every instinct he possessed, begun to trust. "Nikolai Reyes," she said. The silence that followed lasted so long that Cora thought she might have to say it again. Damian stood at the window with his back to her, his shoulders a hard line against the gray afternoon light, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register she had not heard from him before. Not anger, not yet, but something colder and more patient, the sound of a man calculating exactly how much of his old life he was about to burn down. "He was there the night my father died," Damian said. "He was 19. I was 20. We buried 3 men that year, and he never once flinched." He turned to look at her then, and Cora felt the full weight of his attention land on her, like a hand closing around her throat, gentle and absolute. "You understand what you've just handed me?" "I understand what I found," she said, refusing to let her voice shake. "What you do with it isn't my job." "Isn't it?" Damian said, crossing the room slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. "You walked into my building 3 weeks ago as an accountant, Cora Ashford. You are leaving it as the only person alive who knows exactly how deep this goes." His voice dropped lower still. "That makes you either the most valuable person in this building or the most dangerous thing in it. I have not decided which frightens me more." She should have been terrified. Some distant, sensible part of her was terrified. But standing there in the gray afternoon light, close enough to feel the heat coming off him, close enough to see the tightly controlled fury and something rawer underneath it, Cora felt something else entirely, a dangerous, electric certainty that she was no longer just an accountant standing in a rich man's office. She was standing at the center of his world, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not invisible to anyone. What followed over the next several days unfolded like a slow tightening wire. Damian moved with careful precision, giving nothing away to Nikolai, treating him with the same easy familiarity he always had, while quietly, methodically, rerouting every account, every access code, every avenue Nikolai might use to run. Cora worked alongside him now openly, no longer hidden away on the 38th floor, but seated at his side in meetings, her presence a visible, deliberate statement that made the temperature in every room they entered drop by several degrees. She told herself it was only about the case. She told herself that every night, and every night it became a little harder to believe. It was Sophia, Damian's younger sister, who first said out loud what everyone else seemed too careful to name. She cornered Cora in the private elevator one evening, studying her with the same sharp, assessing eyes as her brothers. "He hasn't let anyone that close to him since our father died," Sophia said, not unkindly. "Not because he doesn't want to, because he's terrified of what happens to people who get close to him." She paused, her gaze flicking to the small gold pin at Cora's collar. "You should know what you're standing in front of before it's too late to step back." Cora didn't step back. She told herself it was because the case wasn't finished, because Nikolai was still out there, still dangerous, still capable of unraveling everything the moment he sensed he'd been made. But some nights, lying awake with the city lights bleeding through her curtains, she knew it was something far less reasonable than that. She had spent her whole life being careful, being the woman who left before anyone could leave her first, and here she was, standing in the exact center of the most dangerous man she had ever met, and she could not make herself want to leave. There was a night, 4 days after Sophia's warning, that Cora would replay in her memory more often than any other, long after the danger had passed, and the Empire had settled into its new, uneasy order. Damian had asked her to stay late, ostensibly to review a set of accounts that needed clearing before Nikolai could be quietly frozen out of them. But the numbers sat untouched on the screen between them for nearly an hour, while neither of them spoke. He stood at the window, with a glass of something amber and untouched in his hand, and she sat at the long table behind him, watching the line of his shoulders, the particular stillness that had come to mean he was holding something back, rather than feeling nothing at all. "Ask me," he said finally, without turning around. "Ask you what?" "Whatever it is you've been not asking me for the last 3 weeks." He turned then, and the look on his face was not the cold, calculating expression she'd learned to read in boardrooms. It was something raw, something that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You catalog everything, Cora. Every ledger, every anomaly, every person in this building who looks at you a half-second too long. You've cataloged me, too. I'd like to know what you've found." She should have deflected. She was good at deflecting. She'd built a whole life on the quiet art of being underestimated and unremarkable, of giving people exactly enough to leave satisfied and nothing more. But something about the particular honesty in his voice, the way he'd stripped away every layer of performance between them, made the careful answer die in her throat. "I found a man who is more afraid of being known than he is of dying," she said quietly. "I found a man who watches everyone in every room for the exact moment they're going to use what they see against him. And I found," she continued, her voice dropping, "that he hasn't done that with me. Not once. And I don't understand why. And it terrifies me more than anything else in this entire building." Something shifted in the air between them, a current pulling taut. Damian crossed the room slowly, the way he always moved, as though he had already calculated every possible outcome of every step, and chosen this one deliberately. "Because you never once looked at me like you wanted something," he said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, the way she always did, the way that made her feel simultaneously smaller and more visible than she had ever felt in her life. Everyone who has ever stood this close to me wanted something. My money. My protection. My name. You walked into my office 3 weeks ago wanting nothing from me at all, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since. That's not true, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want plenty from you. I just never thought I was allowed to ask. He didn't move for a long moment, and neither did she. The space between them charged with something neither of them was reckless enough to close. Not yet. Not with Nikolai still loose in the building, and a dead man's ghost still hanging over every account she opened. But when he finally stepped back, his jaw tight, his control visibly, deliberately reassembling itself piece by piece, Cora understood that the waiting itself had become its own kind of confession. When this is finished, he said quietly, ask me anything you want. She held on to that promise over the following days, the way she had once held on to evidence. Carefully, privately, turning it over in her mind until its edges wore smooth. It was almost enough to make her forget the danger circling closer with every hour. The silent man still guarding doors and reading rooms, with eyes that had learned to hide exactly how much he already suspected. Almost. But even in the quiet, electric pull growing between her and Damian Voss, some old, careful part of Cora Ashford never fully stopped watching the exits, never fully stopped counting the ways a room could turn dangerous in half a second. That instinct was the only reason she survived what came next. The break came on a Wednesday night, 9 days after she'd handed Damian the evidence. Cora was working late in her apartment, cross-referencing one final account, when her laptop screen flickered and a message appeared that had no business appearing on a private, encrypted machine. 3 words. Nothing more. I know Cora. Her blood went cold. Before she could process what it meant, her front door lock clicked open from the outside, and Nikolai Reyes stepped into her apartment with the calm, terrible ease of a man who had done far worse things in far worse rooms. You should have stayed invisible, he said quietly, closing the door behind him. That's the only thing that ever kept people like you safe in a world like his. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Cora backed toward the kitchen counter, her heart slamming against her ribs, every old instinct from her bureau years screaming through the panic. Assess the exits, assess the weapon, buy time, buy time, buy time. Warren found the same thing you found, Nikolai continued, moving closer with unhurried steps. He thought loyalty to Damian would protect him. It didn't. I'd hate for you to make the same mistake, but I don't think you will, because I don't think Damian's loyalty extends nearly as far for you as you've let yourself believe. You're wrong, Cora said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her even as she said it. He already knows. He's known for 9 days. She watched the words land, watched the first genuine flicker of uncertainty cross Nikolai's face, and in that half-second of hesitation, she reached for the only weapon within her grasp. Not a gun, not a knife, but the cast-iron pan sitting on her stove from dinner 3 hours earlier, and swung it with every ounce of strength 4 years of chasing dangerous men had ever taught her. It bought her seconds, not safety. Nikolai staggered, cursed, and lunged for her again, and Cora was still backing away, still searching for anything, when the door to her apartment splintered open, and Damian Voss came through it, like something unleashed rather than something arriving. What happened in the next 90 seconds, Cora would remember only in fragments for the rest of her life. The terrible, controlled violence of a man who had spent his whole life learning exactly how to end a threat. The sound of Nikolai's voice breaking from confidence into something closer to fear. And finally, the absolute stillness that followed when it was over. when Damian stood between her and the man who had built an empire of betrayal, one careful lie at a time, breathing hard, his eyes finding hers across the wreckage of her small apartment. "You should have called me," he said, his voice raw in a way she had never heard from him before. "You would have gotten here too late," she said, and something in his face cracked open at that, some final wall giving way, and he crossed the room and pulled her against him, with a desperation that had nothing careful or controlled left in it at all. The days that followed unraveled everything Nikolai Reyes had spent years building. With Cora's evidence trail, methodical and airtight in a way that even federal prosecutors would later admit was remarkable, Damian dismantled every account, every shell company, every carefully hidden thread of the man who had once stood at his side. Nikolai did not survive the reckoning that followed in Damian's world, and Cora, who understood exactly what kind of justice existed in the world she'd stepped into, made her peace with a truth she would have once found unbearable: that some debts in Damian Voss's world were never going to be settled in a courtroom. What surprised her most in the weeks that followed was not the violence or the danger or the empire rebuilding itself around her. It was the quiet. Damian Voss, feared by nearly everyone who had ever stood across a table from him, was gentle with her in a way that felt like a secret only she was allowed to know. The way he learned exactly how she took her coffee without ever asking. The way he cleared his entire evening schedule the first time she mentioned missing her father. The way he looked at her, not like she was ordinary and overlooked, the way the rest of the world had always seen her, but like she was the single most dangerous, most extraordinary thing he had ever let inside his walls. She kept her practice. She kept her sensible shoes and her careful cardigans, though the blazers eventually started fitting a little differently, tailored now by someone who had noticed, quietly and without a word, exactly how she liked to be seen. There was a morning, nearly 2 months after the night Nikolai Reyes had stepped through her front door, when Cora found Damian standing at her kitchen counter before dawn, still in yesterday's shirt, watching coffee drip into a mug that had somehow become permanently his, despite never having been chosen for that purpose. He didn't hear her in the doorway at first, and for one suspended moment she simply watched him. The man an entire underworld feared, the man whose name alone could empty a room, standing barefoot in her small kitchen, like he belonged there, like he had never belonged anywhere else. It struck her then, with a clarity sharper than anything she'd ever traced through a ledger, that the version of Damian Voss the city knew and the version standing in front of her were both entirely real, and that he had chosen, deliberately and completely, to let her see the second one. "You're staring," he said without turning around, and Cora felt the ghost of a smile pull at her mouth. "I catalog everything," she said. "You said so yourself." He turned then, and crossed the small kitchen in 3 unhurried steps, and cupped her face in both hands, with a gentleness that still, even now, caught her off guard every single time, as though some part of him could not quite believe he was allowed to hold something without breaking it. "Ask me," he said again, echoing the words from that night by the window, and this time there was no danger circling the building, no ghost of Warren Pell in the accounts, no silent man waiting behind a door with a debt to collect. There was only the quiet, and the two of them, and the promise he had made her weeks ago finally coming due. "Stay," she said, and it was the smallest word she had ever asked of anyone, and the most dangerous one too, because it meant letting herself want something out loud after a lifetime of learning not to. Damian didn't answer with words. He simply kissed her, slow and certain, the way he did everything, as if he had already decided, long before she'd asked, that there was nowhere else on earth he intended to be. The empire rebuilt itself in the months that followed, leaner and quieter than before, its foundations no longer resting on a betrayal hiding in plain sight. Sophia stopped watching Cora with wary, assessing eyes, and started watching her instead, with something closer to relief. And on the nights when the city outside Damian's windows glittered 40 floors below them, Cora Ashford, who had spent her whole life being the woman nobody watched too closely, understood that she had found the one man on Earth who would never, for as long as either of them lived, stop watching her at all. If you were captivated by Cora Ashford's hidden strength and Damian Voss's dark, consuming obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Cora's shoes? Walked away from that email, or walked straight into the danger the way she did? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a saint.